So after World War One, the United States had become a world power. They had become a player in the game of power in the entire world. But the people back home just wanted to get back to normal. They were so tired of the war and everything that they just wanted to get 100% back to normal. And so they started to act in ways that kind of messed up a couple of things. And so there were a few problems after the war. The first one, Wilson had screwed up on the peace treaty. He messed it up. He had wanted so badly to have that League of Nations that he kind of gave up everything that the Americans wanted and instead just ended up with that League of Nations really on his side, and he came back and nobody wanted the League of Nations. And so the Democrats had become very, very unpopular because as a Democrat he had pushed something that nobody wanted to be involved in. And then also there was an economic recession, and a recession is just a short downturn in the economy where the economy kind of goes down a little bit. And what happened is all these ammunition and war factories shut down because we didn't need the ammunition. We didn't need tanks. We didn't need any of that kind of stuff anymore, or any more of them because they weren't being blown up. And so a lot of people lost their jobs, and these soldiers came back, and the factories were shut down, and their jobs that they had before were full or didn't exist anymore, and so they couldn't find work either. The other thing that happened is any of the jobs that were unionized, any jobs that had labor unions, many of them did a strike. So during the war, they promised we won't strike because we don't want to mess up the war effort. But then as soon as the war ended, they started to organize to strike. And in 1919, 4 million people participated in strikes, and that was about 1 out of every 5 people working any job in all of America. So 1/5 of the labor force did that, and then there was a lot of violence connected with the strikes as well. The last thing that was happening was the Red Scare and racial violence, and so there was violence against African Americans, but there was also violence against these new immigrants and these communists because they thought the Red Scare was that they were afraid of communism, the Reds, which were communists, and what they thought was going to happen is that the communists were going to overthrow the government, and they saw that labor union strike as kind of the first step in that happening. And so there was a new president, there was now an election, and Warren Harding was elected as the president. He was a Republican, so the opposite side from the Democrats who had become very unpopular, and he promised that he would return the country to normal. And so he won by a whole lot of votes because he was what the people wanted. He was promising what the people wanted. And he was interested in building business, and so he filled his administration with a whole bunch of business-minded men that were really good businessmen. And so a lot of these people were his friends who had use their position to make themselves tons and tons of money. But the problem is a lot of them did this through corruption and scandal. Okay, and so just a couple of these guys who kind of did things that people don't see as real positive things. Andrew Mellon was first, and he's the guy on the top here. Not the top of the page because that's Warren Harding, but that's Andrew Mellon. And Andrew Mellon was the Secretary of the Treasury. He was in charge of money, and he was one of the richest men in the entire world. And what he did is he lowered taxes on wealthy people, rich people himself, and businesses. And so the other thing that he did is he cut down the federal budget, which means that less help for poor people. And so he wanted less government, a smaller government, less regulation, so businesses could grow, and he thought then they would hire people and help people out. The other two were more obviously negative. They did more obviously negative things and were corrupt, and that was Charles Forbes and Albert Fall. Charles Forbes is the second guy here, and he, as the head of the Veterans Bureau, took many bribes, and his bribes altogether totaled about $200 million after the investigation. They found that he had taken that many bribes. And then Albert Fall was the biggest scandal of them all. He took part and was in charge of the Teapot Dome scandal. And the Teapot Dome scandal happened in a city called Teapot Dome, Wyoming. And what happened is the government, the federal government, owned an oil reserve. And so they owned all of the oil on it, and they owned the land. Well, what Albert Fall did is he rented it out to an oil company for $400,000, and allowed them to use that land. Well, of course, the oil company is going to come and use that land. They're going to take the oil out of it. That's why they're paying this man so much money. And so he got very rich off of renting land so that they could use oil that wasn't his, that belonged to the government. So he was basically selling government property to a business. And eventually he was one of the first cabinet members of a president to be tried and convicted and sent to prison for corruption. Harding was not. He was a fairly good president on his own, and he wasn't connected to any of the scandals. But he eventually died before most of the scandals were even uncovered. So he died of a heart attack in 1923, and he left his vice president who had to deal with all of the issues, all of the fallout. However, this vice president was Calvin Coolidge, and Calvin Coolidge was basically the perfect person to deal with the issues that were brought up. He was kind of soft-spoken, quiet guy. He was from New England, and what he was known for is honesty and integrity, and that's what we needed, was a president who we knew was honest. And so, of course, Calvin Coolidge, being honest and having integrity, cooperated completely, gave all the documents he could, everything with the investigations, and people started again to trust the government and trust the Republican Party. And during this time, it also helped him that the economy came back and started to bounce back, and people were doing better, and more people had jobs, and there was just more money out there. And so people decided in 1924 that they still wanted to keep the Republicans around, and so Coolidge ran for president, and in 1924, he again won by many, many votes, won by a large margin of votes. So the people wanted to stay out of other countries' business. They wanted isolationism, but the country was a world power. They really couldn't stay out of it. And so they kind of joined into a couple of different agreements. And so the U.S. was involved in some international conferences, mostly to promote world peace and to promote something called disarmament. Disarmament, you have to write the definition of that. Okay, armament is to reduce or limit military. Okay, and so you want to make military smaller, and so what they did is they signed, or America signed, the Washington Naval Arms Conference, and the Washington Naval Arms Conference was a plan to limit the navies of the United States and Britain and France and Italy and Japan, all the victorious groups from World War I were asked to make their navies smaller or limit it a little bit. Okay, they also sponsored the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which is kind of interesting. They sponsored it along with France, and what the Kellogg-Briand Pact did is it said it's illegal to have war or to attack someone with your military at all. But the problem is, it couldn't prevent any wars, because even though they said you shouldn't do this, they didn't set up any punishments for anybody who did it. So if somebody did something, there was no punishment for it. So that's like me setting up a rule and then not having any punishment for breaking that rule. So next up, we're going to talk about the other things that the presidents would do at this time. They would intervene in many different countries and issues if it affected the United States business. And so in Nicaragua, there was a revolution, and America sent troops and got that back under control because they had a lot of businesses down there. And then in Mexico decided at this time to start making the oil lands public, so to start taking the oil away from private companies and have Mexico run it, their government run it. And of course, some of those oil lands were owned by Americans, and so Americans were really upset, and we almost sent troops down there to deal with it, but eventually Coolidge was able to take care of it with diplomacy just by talking to him. The last thing that we did in dealing with other countries is we refused as a country, because we didn't want them to have any power, to recognize the Soviet government. And the Soviet government, that's, Russia was the biggest part of the Soviet Union. It was a communist government. And so communism had taken power, and communism is just the state owns everything. Nobody owns anything. The state owns it, and everybody shares everything. Okay? And so we not only just refused to recognize them, but we also sent troops to help the opponents of communism in Europe. So we were kind of openly aggressive towards them. However, even though we were saying they're not a country and we don't recognize them at all, there was a famine in Russia where people were starving in 1921, and the United States decided to send aid, and estimates are that that saved somewhere around 10 million people from starvation. Time of fear of communism was known often as the Red Scare, but the Red Scare is this fear that the strikes that were happening, the labor strikes that were happening at that time, were the start of a communist revolution. They thought because the communist revolution started off in Russia as a workers' revolution, as a number of strikes. The other thing that was happening is anarchists were throwing and setting off bombs and exploding things, and anarchists are people who don't like any government. They don't want any government around at all, so they just attack any government. So in the summer of 1919, there's explosions happening where people are attacking the government. And the thing about it is most of these communists, most of these anarchists were foreigners. They were immigrants who had just come in. Okay, and so what ended up happening is those Palmer raids that we talked about before happened, where the government would come in and they'd take these people that they assumed or thought or had any evidence or whatever were anarchists or Reds, which Reds is communists, and they would deport them or expel them from the country, just get rid of them and kick them out of the country. Kind of one of the most famous examples of this happening was the Sacco and Vanzetti case. And the Sacco and Vanzetti case, these two men, Sacco and Vanzetti, last names, were charged with robbing and murdering two people. They were payroll employees in Massachusetts. So they had money, the people that they supposedly murdered, and so they killed them, supposedly, and took the money away from them. Now, Sacco and Vanzetti were anarchists, and they were foreigners, and so there was no fair trial at all. There was, like, no evidence during that trial that they did anything. All it did was focused on their character and that they were anarchists and that they were immigrants. And so in 1921, they were convicted, and they were executed in 1927. Were they innocent? Were they guilty? We're not sure. But what we do know, and what is a disappointing thing about the Sacco and Vanzetti trial, is that at this point the system didn't work. We didn't assume that they were innocent. We started off thinking that they were guilty just because of the type of people they were. So we've already talked about throughout history the many reformers who were fighting against alcohol. And so a lot of those temperance reformers started to decide that instead of moderation, they wanted prohibition. And prohibition means completely getting rid of all alcohol. It's completely illegal. And so in 1919, the 18th Amendment passed, and it made alcohol illegal. The reason they made it is for a few different reasons. First off, it was the evils of liquor that we've already talked about, where the men come home and they're drunk and they're not as good at work the next day, and they're mean to their wives and mean to their children, and all these different kinds of things that we've already talked about. The problems associated with liquor, also spending all that money. The second thing, and the reason the support grew for prohibition, is because it was a good way to conserve grains during the war. So oats and barley and all these things are used to make the alcohol, and instead of doing that, they could be used to feed the troops and feed the people. And so people thought, oh, that's a good idea, we should do that. And so as the 18th Amendment came through, it basically says that you are not allowed to make alcohol, sell alcohol, or transport alcohol. So you cannot make it, you cannot sell it to anybody, and you cannot move it from one place to another. Now, prohibition, some people believe it was a good idea, some people think it was bad, but either way, the people didn't want it. A lot of the people didn't want it, and so it became impossible to enforce. Because what would happen is there were all these different groups of people, and they were mostly criminals, and it turned into a really bad deal. So the first group was bootleggers, and bootleggers were people that would move the illegal alcohol. They'd bring it in from other countries. And it was really pretty easy to smuggle it in from Canada or from the Caribbean islands because it was legal there. And so all they'd have to do is move it in the middle of the night and not get caught. And so they were transporting them, and actually they made a lot of money doing that. But what they would do is they'd have these cars, and they had to look like a normal car so you wouldn't be suspicious at all. And they souped them up with these huge engines, and then they'd get together on the weekends and race them. And so that was actually the beginning of NASCAR. If you know what NASCAR is, that's stock car racing, where you race cars that look like just a normal car, but they're souped up on the engine side. So that's kind of interesting. That all started with bootleggers. The second thing that was happening is speakeasies. Speakeasies are bars that served alcohol to people, and it was completely illegal. Oftentimes they were secret. It would be some dance hall or something like that with a secret room with alcohol, sometimes even having like a secret passage or a movable bookshelf where you'd have to get behind it in order to go back there into the bar part with alcohol. And so a lot of these things were run by organized crime, and so organized crime started to grow and get more powerful, and there were all kinds of gangs because there was tons of profit in selling illegal alcohol. All the rich people would come to drink, and the criminals would make lots and lots of money, so it made sense to start creating more and more of these gangs. And so in 1933, with it being impossible, realizing it obviously had failed, the American people signed the 21st Amendment into law, which ended and repealed Prohibition. But the 1920s was a really cool and awesome time to be alive as well. There was lots of new things and nice things going on. For example, technology. Henry Ford during the 1920s and that time of American history invented the Model T, and he had invented the assembly line, which took the price of a car way down because it took the amount of time to build it from 12 hours to build a car to 1.5 hours to build a car. So now every middle class family could afford a car. And so the car, the Model T, gave people a feeling of freedom and individualism, and they could do whatever they want on their own. They didn't have to rely on anybody else. And it also sprang up new options for businesses. And so along these roads where cars were being driven, there were gas stations and restaurants and cabins, which were the start of like motels or hotels that we go to now. They'd have these cabins that you could rent out to stay the night. And so these businesses started to boom as well. The other thing that the Model T did is it allowed people to live in the suburbs, okay? And it made the rural areas, the areas where farmers were and things like that, less isolated, because instead of being stuck there all the time and never seeing anybody else, now you could just drive to your neighbor's house, or you could drive to the closest town, and it was much faster than a horse and easier to get around. So you could easily go to town and back in a day, whereas that might be a weekend trip before when it was just a horse. The second thing we're going to talk about with technology is radio. Entertainment radio was such a huge success. So all of a sudden radio comes out, and any family could afford a radio. It was very easy. And this radio is where they would show baseball games, and they would show political debates. They'd listen to political debates, and you'd listen to music, and you'd listen to comedy, and you'd listen to dramas and all these different things. And so it was really, really successful. The very first radio station was in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. It was called KDKA, and it was made in 1920. By 1926, there were 700 radio stations in the United States. Movies were also just starting at this time in American history, and they quickly became a very big entertainment industry. Most families went to the movie theater about once a week. That's a lot more than we do. Your family does not go to the theater once every single week. But because they didn't have any TV in their homes, they had to, they were much more motivated to go out and see that movie once a week. The movie industry started in Hollywood. Hollywood's a really big kind of capital for our entertainment world because their weather is so good that no matter what, the no matter how fragile the cameras are and stuff like that, they could film all year long because in Hollywood the weather was really nice and mild, so it was never got super cold. There wasn't a whole bunch of rain, and it was just good weather all year round. So kind of a silly reason to have movies centered there, but it kind of makes sense. First of all, when the movies came out, they were silent films, and so there would be no sound with them at all, but actually there would be a person playing a piano or a small group of musicians there making the music that would go along with the film, that would go along with the movie. The very first talkie, the first movie with sound in it where the characters talked, was called The Jazz Singer, and you can see right here the poster for The Jazz Singer. And, you know, as these movies got bigger and there was more talking with them, people got more into them, and America started to really fall in love with especially action films and comedies. And it kind of changed in this idea of celebrity worship, where people think that celebrities are super cool and they want to follow them and have magazines that talk about them and all that kind of stuff. Another interesting thing that happened during the Roaring Twenties was the Scopes trial, and it kind of showed you the difference between the northern part and the southern part of the country. And so John Scopes was who this trial was completely about. And he was a high school biology teacher in Tennessee. And what he did is he taught evolution, and teaching evolution was illegal in Tennessee. All right. And so what he taught is, and evolution is, that life evolved over time. So we all started out as, you know, very simple organisms and evolved into the different animals and people that we are today. Some said that this wasn't correct because it rejected the Bible, because the Bible said that in the beginning, you know, there were two people immediately. And so they didn't like that at all. Scopes, however, kind of became the face of the cause, because the lawyer said, I think we can change this to him. And they said, if you will go out and announce it to everybody that you taught it, and we can challenge the law, we think we can change the law. And so he said, okay, that's fine. And he did it. And so the trial became really big. And it was kind of this idea of the modern urban Americans that believed in science and saw evolution as a real thing, and talked about all these different things and not hiding from it and being all about religion, versus the traditional rural people out in the country that felt that religion was the most important thing. Now, eventually in Tennessee, he did lose his job. He lost the trial, and so he was found guilty of teaching evolution and ended up getting fired. But the laws kind of stayed around for a while because of that, the laws about not being able to teach evolution, but they were really rarely enforced. No one really made a big deal out of it if you taught evolution, unless you were like this guy and kind of announced it to the world. The other thing that was happening, the problem that we were kind of started to talk about a little bit earlier, were the race issues. And there were a lot of issues between black and white people. And so they kind of all started, or, you know, I guess it didn't start with, but it became a bigger issue when the Great Migration happened. And the Great Migration was when African Americans who used to be slaves, or, you know, used to be part of slave families, left the South, where they had been forever, for a very long time, and decided to go to northern cities like Detroit, Chicago, New York City, and they were going there to try and get better paying jobs. The problem was not every single neighborhood allowed black residents, and so they were crammed into just a few neighborhoods within those cities, and some cities didn't like having black residents at all, and so there were huge riots. There was race riots, like one in Chicago where 38 people died and 500 people were injured because of these riots between white people and black people, and anger that turned into violence. One of the leaders at this time for the African Americans was Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey was an extremely gifted speaker, a very good speaker. He's this gentleman down in the corner with kind of the funny hat on, okay? And he started an organization called the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And one of his speeches, one of his most important speeches, he said, "Up, you mighty race, you can accomplish what you will," basically saying that African Americans can accomplish anything that they want to. And so he was really all about black pride and black accomplishment and keeping black people unified. But what he wanted to do that kind of doomed his cause was he wanted people to all move back to Africa. And so eventually the UNIA kind of fell apart because people wanted to stay in the home that they had known forever. Also at this time, with the race issues, the Ku Klux Klan popularity rose, and it was to the point where, you know, these people were the KKK was anti-black, anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic, anti-Jews, okay, and Ku Klux Klan candidates were elected as governors of some state. Now, eventually there were a lot of scandals where these people were involved in, and, you know, the economy got better, and when things are better, it's harder to hate anything, and so the KKK popularity kind of fell at that point. There are also a number of fads during the 1920s that are kind of interesting that we don't really think about very much anymore, but a fad is something that gets really, really popular for a very short period of time, and then all the popularity goes away. A fad when I was a younger kid was Beanie Babies or Pogs. These are things you probably never heard of, but they're toys that were super popular when I was around because they were just a fad. They went away. Some of the fads in the 1920s were special dances. They'd get really popular for a very short period of time, and then they'd lose all their popularity. Things like the Charleston and the Lindy Hop and the Black Bottom and the Breakaway and all of these different things. And they swept the nation really quickly, but they also disappeared really quickly. There were also endurance competitions all across America, and they were things like flagpole sitting and dance marathons. Flagpole sitting is this picture up on the top right corner. People would literally put a chair or something on top of a flagpole, weight up in the air, okay, and then they would sit there, sometimes for hours, sometimes for days. A bunch of people would be on top of flagpoles just sitting there and see who could last the longest. Okay, so that was kind of a crazy, weird thing. And then also there were dance marathons, which are strange too. These people would start dancing, and you wouldn't be allowed to stop dancing. Whoever stopped dancing last would win the marathon. And sometimes these dance marathons would go for hundreds of hours. That's multiple days in a row where you never stop dancing, constantly dancing. Another big fad at the time was Mahjong. Mahjong is these tiles up in the top left-hand corner, and it's kind of like a game like poker, like a card game, except for you play it with tiles instead of cards. And people are really excited about it. It was this Chinese game that got super popular in America, and these women would get together, and they would wear Chinese silks, and then they would play it kind of as almost like a fantasy thing that they were doing to put themselves in another culture. And so they'd set up their tiles on the playing tables with their Chinese silks and play away. Not having as much war in America also created some new types of heroes, peacetime heroes, sports stars, movie stars, things like that. And so people started to get more interested in the life of movie stars and paying attention to that. And then there was a baseball star by the name of Babe Ruth. I'm sure you've heard that name before, but he was a famous baseball player. He was both a pitcher and a great hitter. He had 60 home runs in a season, which was the record for a very, very long time. And then there were also other sports stars, and these other sports stars started to become trendsetters. The things that they wore, other people wanted to wear. The things that they did, other people wanted to do. But the most famous of them all was a pilot by the name of Charles Lindbergh, and everybody loved this guy. Okay, he was a young pilot, and he was the first person to fly all the way across the Atlantic Ocean from America to Europe. And so really, really impressive in 1927 to be able to do that. And so when he returned to New York City, he got the biggest parade, these ticker tape parades that happened in New York City, the biggest one ever. Okay, and what he did, Charles Lindbergh, as this young man, is he symbolized kind of that American energy and optimism, and that we can do and accomplish anything. The new music at the time was jazz. Jazz was music that was being created by black musicians in clubs and things like that in New Orleans, Louisiana. Okay, and it put together a lot of different things. It mixed together the rhythms of West Africa and the Caribbean, the work chants and the spirituals, then the words from the South, and then the harmonies from Western Europe. And it put all of these things together to make this brand new, interesting kind of music. One of the most famous artists was this man down in the corner here. His name's Louis Armstrong, and Louis Armstrong was a great trumpeter and a singer from a New Orleans orphanage, meaning he didn't have any living parents. And the interesting thing about jazz and about what Louis Armstrong was able to do is it's all about improv and experimenting. So every song, there's a spot in it, at least one spot in it, where the trumpeter just gets to do, or the musician gets to do whatever they want. So the song can sound different every single time you hear it. And so the listeners were really excited to hear all these different versions of the exact same tunes, the exact same songs. It also spread because the whole country could hear it because of the new invention of the radio that all the people had. In peacetime, literature was growing too, but a lot of it was kind of critical of what society was like. So it was kind of talking about the bad things of society. And these social critics, these authors, thought America had kind of become selfish, and so they wrote about it. F. Scott Fitzgerald is one of these people. He wrote the book called The Great Gatsby, and it was about this super rich guy who seems really happy, and everybody wants to be him, but he really doesn't have what he wants in life, and he's not really that happy. And so it shows kind of the emptiness of the lives of the rich that everybody wants to be. Ernest Hemingway, another great author at the time, he wrote in short and direct sentences, which kind of became an American style of writing. And then Sinclair Lewis was also a famous writer at the time, and he wrote a book called Babbitt. And it's kind of interesting because Babbitt was about this guy who was just kind of mediocre. He was just kind of okay, but he was okay with it and didn't ever want to become great. And so Babbitry became a synonym for someone who's mediocre and just fine with it, who's just middle of the road person and okay with it and never wants to be anything special. One of those neighborhoods that African Americans started to move into during the Great Migration was Harlem. And so Harlem became kind of a center for African American culture, and the Harlem Renaissance took place. The Harlem Renaissance happened when the African community started to grow in Harlem, and writers and musicians and poets started to really blossom there and reacted against the prejudice that they experienced. They used their art to express their feelings about it. So some of the writers here, like Langston Hughes, he wrote poems that were just beautiful and expressed racial pride, and he wanted them to have the sound of jazz music. He kind of went out of his way to make them as rhythmic and good as he possibly could. And then James Weldon Jones was another man who did poetry and was an excellent writer, but he also combined it with politics. He was one of the first organizers of the NAACP. And so that was really important. And Zora Neale Hurston was also very, very important, not necessarily because she did as much writing herself, but because she recorded a lot of old folk songs and folk tales and things like that so that she could preserve the culture of her people and help to analyze it as much as possible.